Our next speaker is Dr. Marie Huber, a scholar of Persian and comparative literature and assistant professor at Stanford University. She received her PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University. Today, she'll present her paper titled Echoes of Herat, the Legacy of Timurid Musical Practice in Khorasan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Huber.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mihan, for the invitation. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I should also say that I'm a little bit frightened to be among so many eminent scholars of music. As an interloper, I work on poetry, so my focus is a different one. I'm not a musicologist, but I hope that regardless, there will be something interesting in what I have to say. So let me get started. I will have to talk fairly quickly because I have maybe too many words in my talk. I would like to start with two lines from a poem by مهدی اخوان ثالث. سرحدی عجیب تو فریاد قرن هاست در آن دوتار گشته نهان گرم های او. And you have my translation here. So this is a line in the poem Dotāri Samandari by Mehdi Akhavan Saleh, the eminent poet of Persian modernity. Most of the great dotār masters were still alive in 1984 when the poem was written. Not only Hossein Samandari, but also Nazar Muhammad Soleimani, Nur Muhammad Dorpur, Murad Ali Salad Ahmadi, Ghulam Ali Puratai, or Abdullah Sarwar Ahmadi. I mention these figures in part as a token against oblivion, as if pronouncing their names could bring back voices that lived and died with the moment of performance. Much has changed since the last century and the time of Akhavan's elegy. The watershed of the Islamic Revolution, the precarious position of the Sufi orders, the rise of a new kind of Shiite religious nationalism, the spread of mass media, and the attrition of the social fabric of the community in which the dotāris of Torbat-e Jām could close the circles of divine recollection. So they talk about Halqe Bastan. Have all been weakening the foundations of dotārī practice and made it increasingly impertinent to our age. In Akhavan's poem, the memory of an effect is invoked belatedly in poetic speech. It is the almost corporeal shrine to an experience that has been lost into song. Partly cut off again, but as long as you can see something. So my first, I was going to put some intertitles, but I'm going to speak the intertitles instead. So the first one is Borders. Akhavan's words kindled a desire to hear the dotār and the strange lament. In 2013, many years after first reading the poem, the chance arose for me to visit Torbat-e Jām, one of the regional capitals of what is now called Khorasan province, close to the border of modern-day Afghanistan. There's a particular sense of space in these liminal lands that once formed the heart of Greater Khorasan, but are now relegated to the pastoral edges of modern Iran. Like the spaces they inhabit, the dotāris too belong to the margins. Unlike modern Turkey, where traditional folk music was harnessed for the creation of a national music, the regional traditions of Iran were never part of the Qajar or Pahlavi nation-building enterprises. Except for a brief interlude of ethnographic interest in the 1970s, Iran's diverse non-classical music traditions have remained indissociable from the peripheral status of various ethno-religious identities, the quote-unquote internal other that Kurds, Turkmen, Lurs, Azeris, Baloch, Sunnis, or Arabs are to this day. On the slide here, you see two images. The picture on the right is a still from Farshad Fadayan's 2007 documentary on Ustad Nur Muhammad Dorpur. It's titled Zakir. The photo on the left was taken on the day of my visit to Bokhars on the 17th of October 2013. A string of serendipities had led to encounters that would make the trip possible. All throughout, There was a sense of being witness to something extraordinary, something that Akhavan's words capture powerfully. The blurry photograph on the slide was taken with a battered old mobile phone. What you see is a figure, a certain non-urban space, not unlike the village spaces in Iranian new wave cinema, and the horizon. I've been told only moments before that the border to Afghanistan was over there. Indeed, the other side seemed almost reachable. In 2013, the quickest way to Herat was still by taking the plane to Mashhad and then catching the overland bus. Afghanistan continues to be a foreign, inferior other to city dwellers across Iran, and the scars of discrimination are ever present. In the villages around Torbat, however, the space beyond the border, along with those who have crossed it, figures as a place of origin rather than the byword of an otherness neglected by history. Poetic genealogies are forged and stories abound of dotār players from Afghanistan come to settle in Bokhars, Khaf, or Toyibad. The eminent scholar and composer Fawzi Majd, who in the years leading up to the Islamic Revolution traveled across Iran to record so-called regional music traditions for national Iranian radio and television, mentions an old man from Marv who had left his home for Iran. And she quotes him, شیوه خواندنش متفاوت بود، کهن بود و واقعی، بنابراین تاثیر دیگری داشت. So his manner of singing was different. It was ancient and real, which is why it had another kind of impact. All of the old dotār masters recount having learned parts of the repertoire from various figures, clerics, Sufis, or itinerant musicians who hailed from the other side of the border. Historical maps are difficult to come by, while modern maps tend to ensconce anachronistic geographies, emphasizing ruptures over continuities. This particular map is taken from Shivan Mahendra Raja's study of Ahmad Jām, the patron saint of Torbat. The map shows a space without borders that captures not only a moment in history, but also the memory of a Timurid cultural ecumeny that lives on in the villages of South Khorasan. Now, my second intertitle is The Performative Matrix. I would now like to share part of a recording I made on the 17th of October 2013, a performance of what may be the most iconic piece of dotārī repertoire, Navā'i. Numerous recordings exist of Navā'i. The first, supervised by Fawzi Majd in the 1970s, captures Murad Ali Ahmadi. Yes, echo.
Hi, the recordings tend to abstract the artifact. The song program and mentioned the
unit
from modern to call the performative matrix. The time and place of the voice extending out to this voice was giving and to be received by participating in the audience.
They also cut out the background sounds and comments unfolding around the performance, along with the performer's instructions on how to understand a poem. Finally, they homogenize, as it were, language itself. What you will hear over the next couple of minutes, and I think I'm only going to play 4 minutes, is a polyphonic structure of different accents and linguistic registers existing in parallel. First, the standard educated urban Persian of the main interlocutor. Second, the local, rural inflection of Ustad Durkur speaking in Torbati dialect. Characteristic here is the om ending for the first person singular shared with Daddy. So he says khondom instead of khondam, which is distinctly the pointing eastwards. Third, the more or less standard Persian in which the poem itself is pronounced. These registers carry meaning as markers of class, education, and ultimately history. Immaterial and localized, they depend on the presence of technology to be recorded, transmitted, and studied as phenomena along a temporal axis. It was the radical separation of voice from its point of origin, effected by the radio, which, from the inception of broadcasting in 1939, helped to install the Tehrani dialect over a patchwork of local idioms. However, my primary aim here is not to chart the mechanisms of modernization, but to trace the voice back to the locus of moment from which it emerges, to be shared with a receiving and responding audience. In the process, I hope to shed light on a tradition that continues to exist, as if in defiance of the standardization efforts that fundamentally changed both poetic practice and language itself in the modern era. Now, I would like to play about 4 minutes of the recording. I cannot play all of it because that would be, because we're already a bit short of time. This, I will be playing part of the song poem. We cannot read it all. I assume most of you know Persian. This is my translation, imperfect, but I think it's good enough for you to see what is happening in the language. But now let us listen to the piece itself and also to the comments. I'm going to play some of that because that will be central to what I'm hoping to say. Sorry. Now, I had to cut out quite a bit of what he says, but if you were able to tune into the idiom that he's talking in, the Khorasani idiom, you might have caught the suggestion of a migrant origin on the porous border in Ustad Dorpur's account. So he says, as Afghanistan yeki vezne Habibullah mi omad, Jāmi and Navā'i. So someone by the name of Habibullah used to come from Afghanistan and play this very Navā'i. Several poems in the repertoire of the dotār masters of Torbat-e Jām are attributed to the literati of Herat, above all to Abdurrahman Jāmi. However, the takhalus or sonic signature at the end of the poem is deceptive. So it says here, Umidwari Jāmi befardai mashar. Navā'i does not appear in any manuscript of Jāmi's works. Instead, with Navā'i, as with other poems, we encounter the absence of a stable name and a clear point of emergence, whether musical or poetic. The ascription of authorship here resembles the invocation of fictional histories and creates genealogies that connect both singer and audience to a point in time and space that is imagined to be real. In other words, the practice of the dotār masters appears to carry on a tradition that hails back to a geocultural space that was held together by a shared cultural vocabulary. However, the ambiguous origin of poems and music alike fails to square with modernity's quest for pure sources. So it cannot be harnessed, as in the case of Uzbekistan we have seen. Anyway, modernity is a topic in itself. Ultimately, we are left with nothing but the accounts of the dotār masters themselves. It is the thought of a voice, a human breath of garm hoihu, and you heard the hey of Ustad Dorpur, living on beyond the intellectual, geopolitical, and social divisions brought on by the 20th century that continues to haunt and unsettle our scholarly frameworks. Now, my third intertitle is Lyric Performance. Sorry, next slide. Next slide. Thank you. For the remainder of this talk, I would like to focus on Navā'i and the 5 principles that I propose animate the musical and poetic practice of the Naqshbandi Sufis. Number 1 is the self-referentiality and semantic quote-unquote emptiness of the poem. Unlike narrative prose, lyric poems do not construct their own coherent fictional worlds, but are plotless constellations until enacted in a performance that anchors them in our present. In this, the poem can be analogous to a musical notation. The second point is the empty space at the center of the poem. In the moment of performance, the lyric I becomes embodied by that of the performer, the reciter, singer, storyteller, and inhabited by the listener. Number 3 is time and the experience of time in performance. Ethnomusicologist Regula Burkhardt-Qureshi writes that with relation to time, the assumption is that the musical work embodies cognitive time notions or concepts, but that its performance generates a time experience through sound perception which transcends, yet incorporates cognition by creating an existential reality of a continuous present. And that's a bit of a mouthful, but we'll come back to it. Number 4 is the modality of memory that underlies both the poem itself and the devotional practice that is centered in it. The poem is the moment between the experience that has been, so the mystic vision, in our case, of Layli, and the future that is promised, the messianic horizon or the Fardai Masha. Number 5 is the community in which all performance is necessarily embedded. The expression Hazrezek Bastan describes the ritual of the Sufis as the coming into being of a transient community rooted in speech or voice breath. So hey, or hoy, or who, the cri de cœur that pierced the songs of the dotār masters, and you heard that hey at the end, or not at the end, before the last verse of Navā'i, without ontological separation between performer and audience. Now these are the points, and hopefully they will become clearer as we sort of proceed towards the end. My fourth in the title is setting. Now, again, this is a bit cut off, but you see the image here. So it's still from a film. Again, this is the new wave, the 1970s, when the interest was very, very clear, and the ethnographies of Iran. And you see here the Padre Khan telling the story of Karbala. You see the village audience sitting here, and you see, I think it's the revolution not very good, but you see these Khorasani traditionally dressed men bringing in a TV set. And then the later scene, they will be sitting, the village audience will be sitting inside watching the TV, and the TV is not showing anything, it's just showing gibberish, and they break out and they find it all very funny. So maybe this is also very timely at the moment. So Parviz Kimyavi's 1973 film, The Mongols, offers a scathing critique of the impact of new media on village communities in Iran after national Iranian radio and television began regular programming in 1967. Once the human origin of all narration and connected to his audience through the experience of what Burkhard Qureshi calls the existential reality of a continuous present, the storyteller here becomes redundant. The performative matrix is undone. For Kimyavi, nothing remains but abstract noise greeted by vacuous laughter. It is the existential connection between performer and audience in which the practice of the dotāris around Torbat-e Jām is rooted, as a covenant between singer and listener in the moment of sacred audition or sama. Text, music, and devotional practice emerge from the same matrix. Michel de Certeau speaks of the volo, or unwilling, that lies at the origin of the mystic's utterance. The affirmation of a will to enter into covenant with the divine. A similar volo, I propose, is the foundation of dotārī performance. There, the significance of a poem is determined by the setting in which it is sung and received. Love and desire are the existential stakes at the heart of all poetic speech. However, the lines between erotic and mystical love cannot always be drawn. In Navā'i, as in countless other poems sung around Torbat, Layli and God are an indivisible whole, resembling two faces of the same coin. It is the circumstances of the performance and, as the dotār masters themselves affirm, the silent intention of the participants that guide our understanding in one way or the other. Meaning, rather than fixed within the text itself, is thus contingent on the setting, with each performance understood as the votive offering of a community, an act of speech that gives rise to a transient reality and a constellation of desire. The unique union of music, text, and performance in the practice of the Naqshbandi Sufis is unstable. Festivals of regional music across Iran have been offering an artistic platform and a source of additional income. Since the dotāris of Torbat-e Jām are for the most part farmers, so unprofessional, non-professional musicians, the livelihood is vulnerable to climate events, and the uncertain economic conditions make it difficult to continue an art that is tied to the place from which it emerges. As we speak today, the iconic masters have passed away. Some of their descendants are keeping the practice alive, and there's no lack of media interest in the dotār as a carrier of regional identity. However, the circumstances of performance have changed in fundamental ways. The community itself, the circle of Sufis engaged in remembrance, is no longer the bedrock of the practice it used to hold up. Economic hardship, rural exodus, the precarious status of Sufi orders, along with the marginal position of Sunnis in Iran, are eroding the traditional performance settings. The dotār masters of Torbat belong to a vanishing live world, and to paraphrase Jean-Luc Nancy, a community that might soon be inoperative. In their practice, a fleeting bond still comes into being, rooted in speech or voice breath with each circle formed. Now, fifth intertitle, The Poetic Horizon. Domenico Ingenito, in his study of Sadi, speaks of the body of the subject as the almost that separates the visible from the invisible. This almost is, I believe, the condition of possibility for the experience of desire itself. It is the promise of something that can only ever be moved towards, but never reached. With each new poetic performance, the bridge of desire between the visible and invisible worlds is extended anew. Francesco Giusti, in his discussion of a sonnet by Dante, writes that the poem is conceived as a verbal substitute for Beatrice, that, when recited, aims to induce the same effects in its readers that the actual woman induces in her beholders. Further down, Giusti continues, the crystallized moment, which encapsulates iteration, moves towards the final sigh, that is the threshold to the fullness of experience, and from where the poem can begin again. The poem happens after its end and before its beginning. In other words, Dante's text, the poetic artifact, serves as a placeholder for the beloved, while the experience invoked in and by the poem is iterable, enacted again from the beginning with each new recitation. I would like to argue that both for Dante and the folk, quote-unquote, poets of Torbat-e Jām, the poem is firstly a movement of infinite approximation, and these are the words of Friedrich Hölderlin, the German poet, animated by desire and longing for the others, so Beatrice, or in the case of Navāʿi, Leili, God. Secondly, an almost physical token, a voice song, in Persian Navā, for the absence, no longer reachable beloved. And thirdly, the memory capsule of a fictional or fictionalized experience to be unfolded in time with each new performance. After all that has been said, let us take another look at Navāʿi. At the heart of the poem is the song or sigh, semantically empty, untranslatable, reaching out towards the you without stable referent. Repeated as a refrain, or to use the liturgical terms, an antiphonic response that suggests both rhythmic circularity and the presence of a community. Navāʿi, 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 Navāʿi. Who is speaking and addressing a you? Does Navāʿi repeated 4 times mean you're the voiced breath, the song? Is Navāʿi a circular gesture of self-referentiality of the poem addressing itself, or finally, albeit unlikely, of an invocation of Alishir Navāʿi? Perhaps we're supposed to keep wondering in a state of suspension. Just like the you of the address is uncertain, so the beloved too is absent. Unlike Beatrice, Leili God never reveals herself. She's existentially, as it were, veiled. Her grace is but the memory trace of a vision that may never have happened, but nonetheless has an almost corporeal reality in the poet's mind. Her place is an empty cipher, the unattainable space inside the howdah. Ustad Lodhpur makes it clear how to read the poem when he tells us, and he says that in his comments or in his gloss on how to understand Navāʿi. This Navāʿi is a tale of ascension. In Navāʿi Merat Namas, the ascension into the highest presence is also ours. The foundation for the lyric eye becoming embodied in the listener lies here, in the invitation to inhabit the speech situation. It is also the ground on which spiritual audition or sama can be understood as a devotional practice. In the moment of embodied song, we too ascend into the presence of the beloved before once more falling back into time-bound space, in an event that recurs with each recitation. The time of the poem is the iterable now of messianic time, the fardai mashar of the poem. The voiced sigh or Navā and the hope of redemption are at once the poet's, ours, and that of the singer in the moment of song. Does Navāʿi too come to happen after its end and before its beginning? Now my epilogue, I'm almost done, is to To conclude, I would like to return to Akhavan's poem. It speaks of a mongrel origin and a voice enshrined or enshrouded in the dotār. Sarhadi is both the name of a melodic genre or maqām shared with Herat and the index of a marginal existence along the border. So had is the border, Sarhadi is that which belongs to the margin, to the border. Gharib points to strangeness, itinerancy and non-belonging, but also to poverty outside of the courts. So we're not dealing with a courtly tradition here. Can we reconstruct the Timurid origin for the songs of the Naqshbandis of Torbat-e Jām? Maybe we should pose the question differently. How can we read time in the absence of a manuscript tradition? Our main written sources are by nature impermanent. The compendia or bayars circulated among the Naqshbandis preserve an image of the poems at a particular historical moment. In the end, only the accounts of the masters themselves remain. In them, lineages are constructed with each song, pointing to a cultural space that no longer exists. The Timurid Empire of Letters. Jāmi lives almost the imaginary point of origin of a practice that is, in the words of George Steiner, impertinent to our age. Thank you. Question? No?
I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much. I'm just working through what you were saying about the different kinds of temporality and continuous present, and also memories of things past, and crisis, etc. Could you say a bit more about how these approaches to time, sort of literary time, messianic time, how do they fit in with historical time? So, as at the beginning, you're talking about echoes of heritage, and it's very much in place, right? Particular historical around it. So, how do you think memories of historical time or historical imaginaries, how do they intersect the temporality of historical?
That's an absolutely wonderful question. I'm not sure if I have a very good answer to that. And the whole idea of time is something that pervades any kind of Sufi text. So it is always the experience of the mystic vision that and the memory of that, sometimes fictionalized, but that is at the very origin of all the Sufi accounts. So you have the origin, you have the time before memory, and you have the messianic horizon that is sort of protending towards towards the reunion. The memory of the union always drives the desire for a new union. So you have this generative wheel almost in which the Sufi poetry moves. So I do not know that these two times of temporalities necessarily touch. I think they kind of exist in parallel. I think in the practice of the dotāris, you have the invocation, you have the creation of these fictional histories, you have the invocation of a past that is in many ways a memorial past. The poems themselves do something, obey their own rules of Sufi poetry. So I think the two kind of move in parallel. I don't know if that is a very satisfactory answer, but I think they do not necessarily touch. I think the two parallel strands that are happening that we see here.